For a start, remember the technical terms and how they define the argument: a priori and a posteriori, inductive and deductive, synthetic and analytic, subjective and predicate, necessary and contingent. The basis of the argument in thought. The ontological argument is based on the claim that God's existence can be deduced from his definition. Once God is correctly defined, there can be no doubt that he exists, using the list of technical terms above. The ontological argument claims that the proposition God exists is a priori deductive. You don't need sense experience to know that it is true. You know that it is true just by thinking about it. In the proposition God exists, the subject God contains the predicate exists. So God must exist. It's as clear as knowing that bicycles have two wheels. God's existence is a necessary truth, not a contingent one. Anselm's a priori ontological argument and criticism from Guinillo. Anselm's ontological argument from Philosophy&more 2. Use the shortened form of the argument as a basis for remembering the whole. God is the greatest conceivable being. Part 2. It is greater to exist in reality than to only exist in the mind. Conclusion. Therefore, as the greatest conceivable being, God must exist in reality. Now add the bits about fools and painters and you've got it. Criticism from Guinillo, on behalf of the fool. This uses a parody of Anselm's argument to show that it is absurd. Part 1. It is possible to conceive of the most perfect and real lost island. Part 2. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. Conclusion. Therefore, the most perfect and real lost island must exist in reality. So Guinillo is saying that the real fool would be anybody who argued in this way. Anselm's reply to Guinillo from Philosophy&more 3 and the Responsio. Part 1. To be perfect, an island would have to be that island than which no greater can be conceived. Part 2. An island than which no greater can be conceived would have to exist necessarily, since a contingent island would be less perfect than an island that existed necessarily. Part 3. But islands are contingent, so cannot exist necessarily. Conclusion. Therefore, the logic of the argument related to the perfect island did not apply to God. Further. Part 1. God is the greatest conceivable being. Part 2. The greatest conceivable being cannot be conceived not to exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God and God alone possesses necessary existence. God cannot not exist. In summary, Anselm gives a clear refutation of Guinillo's perfect lost island argument. He shows that necessary existence is a predicate only of God and not of other things. Anselm's response to Guinillo seems very powerful, but it's hard to see how Anselm would have replied to Kant's objections, given here, which most scholars think defeat Anselm's argument. Criticism from Kant. Objection 1. Existence is not a predicate. Kant attacks Descartes' ontological argument that as the supremely perfect being, God must possess all of the perfect predicates, such as omnipotence and omniscience, and perfect existence. But existence is not a real predicate. So if we list all of God's predicates, omnipotence, omniscience, and so on, and then add existence, we add nothing to the concept of God. The only way I can know that talas exist is to experience them, so the only way I can know that God exists is by sense experience, not logic. Objection 2. We can accept that necessary existence is part of what we mean by God, but it does not follow from this that God exists in reality. Think, unicorn. A unicorn is a horse with a horn, is logically true, because that's how we define a unicorn. But it does not follow from this that there really are any unicorns. Equally, God exists necessarily is logically true, because that's how we define God, but it does not follow that there really is a God. Think if. If there are unicorns, then there will be horses with horns. If there is a God, then God will exist necessarily. Strengths and weaknesses of the ontological argument. Strengths. The argument is deductive, so it works. It is a proof. Not only that, according to Karl Barth and others, the argument succeeds precisely because there is not meant to be a logical proof, it's confession of faith. For those with faith, the ontological argument is clear to their faith. The ontological argument is a good training ground in learning how to do philosophy. Weaknesses. Most agree that Kant's two objections defeat all ontological arguments. They do not disprove the existence of God, but they do show that God's existence cannot be shown by logic. Some reject Anselm's definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, but Christians such as Aquinas reject any attempt to define God, because if we were able to define God, it would limit him. Against that, some people would say that Anselm's definition is a good place to start, and we know what it means. The status of Anselm's argument is proof. He should contrast the deductive a priori ontological argument with inductive a posteriori arguments like the design argument. Inductive arguments can only be probability arguments, but the deductive ontological argument is a proof if we agree that the argument works. The ontological argument does not seem to work, since most agree that Kant's objections defeat it. Moreover, it does not have the status of a mathematical proof, where the truth of 2 plus 2 equals 4 is obvious to everyone. If the ontological argument was really a proof, there would be no argument about the ontological argument either. You might want to argue that it is a proof in Barth's sense, that it is obvious to faith. The value of Anselm's argument for religious faith. In Philosophy&more, Anselm argues that the fool does not have an adequate concept of God. Someone who truly understands the definition of God as that than which nothing greater could be conceived must then understand that this being exists. Anselm appears to say that he was helped to this understanding by a religious experience. Karl Barth develops a similar view. B. This is primarily about Barth's interpretation of Anselm's argument that it is cast in the form of a prayer rather than logical proof. It is based on a religious experience in which God revealed a name to Anselm, than which nothing greater can be conceived. If we could prove God's existence by logic, there would be no need for faith or for trust in God. Nevertheless, Anselm's prayer is directed towards the atheist fall in Psalm 14:4. If the argument is not intended to give an atheist a logical proof of God's existence, why does Anselm go to so much trouble to show that his argument is right? In the preface of Proslogium, Anselm says that he is looking for a proof. Why else would he bother to respond to Guinillo? Guinillo constructs a reply to Anselm's logic, and Anselm replies in kind. They are arguing about logic, not about faith. For Anselm, faith-seeking understanding means an active love of God, seeking a deeper knowledge of God. The argument has value for those who believe in God already, since they are more likely to accept that it is a logical proof. But many Christians disagree about the last points. Fides would argue that if we could prove God's existence by logic, faith would lose all of its value.